You step into a world where every invitation has been sent, every seat at an $800,000 wedding already reserved except one. Yours. Your parents claim your presence would overshadow your sister's perfect day. That moment was not just a refusal, but a silent verdict, reviving memories of being pushed aside since childhood. What would you do if the very family meant to hold you close chose instead to erase you on such a day of unity? Stay with this story, because what begins as exclusion will unfold into something far more powerful. And if you feel the weight of these emotions, a gentle like and a thoughtful subscribe will be more than enough to keep us sharing these heartfelt journeys together. You remember the silence more than the words. The silence that followed the call, when your parents calmly told you not to come. At first, you thought it was a misunderstanding, a mistake in planning, an oversight in communication. But the more they spoke, the more you realized it wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. They had chosen to remove you, just as they had chosen so many times before to place your sister at the center and move you quietly into the shadows. You sit surrounded by the photographs of weddings you have captured for strangers. Couples laughing under golden light, hands clasping with promises of forever, moments frozen in frames that whispered of belonging and joy. These were not just pictures. They were fragments of stories you had carefully preserved for others. And yet, when it came to your own family, there was no place for you in the frame. From childhood, the signs had been there. You remember birthdays where the cake carried her name in larger letters than yours. You remember the refrigerator that once held your artwork, replaced overnight by stick figures that your sister had drawn. You recall the day you brought home a trophy for photography at age 12, only to hear your father quietly tell you to put it away, so Lily would not feel left behind. Small cuts, so subtle at first, became the rhythm of your life. Each time you stood tall, someone reminded you to shrink just enough to let her shine brighter. The day of the phone call, however, wasn't subtle. It was a declaration. Your mother's voice carried no hesitation when she said, "You ruin her wedding." And the phrase echoed through your chest like an iron bell. You weren't simply uninvited. You were cast out. Every guest was welcomed, every cousin included, every family member counted except you. You pressed your palm to your forehead, trying to steady your breath, but the memories of years gone by swept over you. Thanksgiving dinners where she sat on your father's lap at the adult table while you remained with the younger cousins. High school ceremonies where your accomplishments were brushed aside to highlight hers. Even now, as an adult with your own career, with clients who trusted your vision, with magazines that praised your work, you were still the one they could remove without hesitation. And yet, something different stirred inside you that day. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of carrying away too long. Perhaps it was the presence of Ethan, who had never once asked you to diminish yourself. Or perhaps it was simply the truth finally becoming too loud to ignore. Whatever it was, you realized this pattern would never end unless you broke it yourself. You walked across the hardwood floor of your apartment, fragments of a broken mug scattered across the ground. Coffee stained the edges of your photographs, brown edges curling where moments of joy once lived. You bent to gather them, and as you did, the question rose in your chest. How long will I let myself be erased? Ethan came home that evening, his camera back slung over his shoulder, his face softening with concern when he saw you on the floor. "Courtney, what happened?" Close quote, he asked, and the words tumbled out before you could stop them. The uninvitation, the excuses, the lifetime of being diminished. He listened without judgment, without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. His silence was not like your family's silence. His silence was the kind that made room for your truth to exist. Later, as the night stretched on, you sat together at the table, scrolling through messages from your clients. Their words told a story your family never could. "She captured the moment I realized love was real. Her photographs gave me back a memory I thought I had lost. Every time we open our album, we relive the best day of our lives." They saw you, even when your own parents refused to. They celebrated what your family dismissed. It was in that moment that resolve began to take shape. You were not just a shadow. You were not just someone to be pushed aside. You were a storyteller, an artist, someone who had built a life out of capturing beauty and truth. If your family could not see it, then perhaps it was time to stop waiting for their eyes to open. Days turned into weeks, and the wound of being excluded remained, but so did a new idea. What if you created something for yourself? What if you chose to stand tall instead of shrinking once more? The idea was terrifying at first, but also electrifying. You had spent so many years shaping your life around the approval of those who would never give it. What if you stopped asking for permission? Ethan's suggestion arrived like sunlight breaking through clouds. "What if we got away for a weekend?" Close quote, he said. "Clear your head. Just us." And in that simple invitation, you saw more than a break. You saw the possibility of rewriting the story. Because perhaps the choice wasn't between being part of your sister's wedding or being left behind. Perhaps the real choice was between living small under their rules or living fully under your own. So you began to dream. Not of revenge, not of competition, but of something true. A ceremony not about proving your worth, but about embracing it. A day not about being measured against Lily, but about stepping into your own life without apology. And as that dream began to take shape, so did your courage. In moments like these, stories are not just told, they are lived. And if you feel even a fragment of this struggle in your own life, let it remind you that silence is not the only answer. Quiet support means the world, and if you choose to walk alongside stories like this, tapping subscribe gently is a way to say, keep telling them. You thought the sting of exclusion would fade with time, but instead, it spread like ink across every thought. Each morning, you woke with the same question pressing against your chest. How could they erase me so easily? The voices of your parents lingered in your ears, calm, almost casual, as if removing you from the wedding was not cruelty, but common sense. As if you were the unreasonable one for even daring to protest. Your mother's words returned to you most often. You'll ruin her wedding. 4 words that carried the weight of a lifetime. You wanted to ask her what she meant. How could you, who had spent years capturing joy for others, ruin a single day by simply existing? But deep down, you already knew. It wasn't about what you might do. It was about who you were. To them, you had always been too much, too visible, too accomplished, too unwilling to fade quietly behind your sister's glow. You remembered being 10 years old at a family picnic, watching as relatives crowded around Lily while you sat with your sketchbook. Your aunt leaned down, patted your shoulder, and said, "You're so talented, but don't show off too much, let your sister have her moment." It was a small comment, spoken with a smile, but it cut deep. That moment set a pattern that repeated endlessly. At 13, when your photograph was displayed in a local gallery, your father told you not to invite too many friends. "It might make Lily uncomfortable," close quote, he said. At 16, when you received a scholarship, your mother hurried you from the stage to attend Lily's debate competition. At 20, when your work was featured in a magazine, they remained silent, as though pretending not to notice would make it less real. Each memory was a thread, and together they formed a tapestry of dismissal. And now, being uninvited to the wedding wasn't just another thread, it was the frame that bound them all, the undeniable proof that you had never truly been welcomed. Still, part of you wondered if Lily knew the full truth. Did she really believe you wanted to outshine her? Or had she simply inherited the narrative your parents had been spinning all along? That night, you sat on the edge of your bed, phone in hand, staring at her number. You typed and erased a dozen messages before leaving the screen blank. What could you possibly say to a sister who had agreed, even partly, to your absence? The days that followed blurred together. Work became both a refuge and a reminder. You poured yourself into editing wedding albums, watching couples beam at each other through the lens of your camera. You had captured their joy with such clarity, yet in your own life, joy felt distant, unreachable. Sometimes you caught yourself staring at an image too long, as if searching for the belonging you had never felt. When friends asked about the wedding, you forced a smile, saying you were busy with other commitments. The lie sat heavy on your tongue, but the truth felt impossible to share. To admit you had been erased by your own family felt like confessing a wound too raw for words. One evening, Amanda, a friend who straddled the line between your world and Lily's, called. "Cord, I don't know if I should tell you this," close quote, she said softly, "but I overheard Lily telling Bradley that you make everything about yourself." The words sank into you like cold water. Bradley had never even met you, and yet he already carried an image shaped entirely by her stories. Stories of you overshadowing her, stealing attention, being selfish. None of them true, but repeated often enough to sound believable. You felt a hollowness settle in your chest. Not only had your parents cast you aside, but now your sister was rewriting your history in front of strangers. And the worst part? The family would believe her. They always had. That night, scrolling through social media, you stumbled upon your mother's latest post. A photo of Lily and Bradley, champagne glasses raised, surrounded by white roses. The caption read, "Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is step back and let others shine." You stared at the words until they blurred, realizing they were aimed squarely at you. To the world, it looked like wisdom. To you, it felt like erasure turned into public art. The grief was heavy, but beneath it, something stronger began to stir. Anger, yes, but also clarity. You began to see the pattern with new eyes. It wasn't isolated moments. Later, he opened his laptop and began reading the reviews your clients had left. "She didn't just photograph our wedding," close quote, one said. "She gave us the memory of love itself." Another, "She has a gift for seeing people as they truly are." He read them aloud until your tears blurred the screen. These voices painted a picture that your family had refused to acknowledge, a picture of your worth. You closed your eyes and let the truth sink in. Perhaps you didn't need their recognition to validate your story. Perhaps the love you sought had been in front of you all along, in the eyes of clients, in the arms of Ethan, in the friendships you had chosen. Still, the ache lingered. Because no matter how much you tried to rise above it, the wound of being excluded by your own family was not something that could be erased in a single night. You carried it with you every time you walked past a wedding shop, every time you opened your inbox to a new client request. It was there, reminding you of what you had lost, not just an invitation, but a place in the family story. Yet even as you carried that pain, you began to sense its shape changing. What once felt like a chain pulling you down now felt more like a weight you could set aside. Slowly, steadily, you realized you didn't need to live smaller anymore. In life, we often wait for others to recognize our value, forgetting that recognition begins with ourselves. If this story resonates with you, let it be a quiet reminder. Your worth is not defined by who excludes you, but by how you choose to keep walking. And if you'd like to continue walking through stories like this together, tapping that subscribe button is simply a gentle way of saying, I want to hear more. The days dragged forward, heavy with silence. Each hour seemed to echo the rejection you had endured, yet within that silence, a small ember began to glow. You realized that the ache you carried could not be mended by waiting for their apology. It would never arrive. Instead, you would have to create something new, something that belonged only to you. Ethan saw it first. He saw the way you studied the golden light outside your window, how your eyes lingered on images of places far beyond the reach of family judgment. One evening, as the two of you sat on the couch with untouched coffee between you, he broke the silence. What if we stopped waiting for them to let us in? Close quote, he asked softly. What if we built something of our own? Close quote, the idea struck like lightning. At first, it frightened you. Your whole life, you had measured each step against their approval. To imagine a life without that tether felt unsteady, like walking on a rope stretched across an endless sky. And yet, somewhere deep inside, you recognized the truth. You had already been walking that rope for years, only without realizing it. When Ethan showed you photographs of a villa perched on the cliffs of the Amalfi Coast, something stirred within you. The stone walls, draped with jasmine vines, overlooked a sea so wide it seemed to carry the horizon itself. The light there was the kind you had chased your entire career, warm, honest, golden. For years you had captured it for others, but never once for yourself. What if, close quote, Ethan continued, scrolling through images, this could be ours. Close quote, you hesitated, 1,000 doubts rising in your throat. Wouldn't this provoke more anger from your parents? Wouldn't this be seen as trying to compete with Lily? But then, another voice cut through the noise. Does it matter? You thought of every time you had made yourself smaller to protect their comfort. Every award hidden, every success muted, every joy postponed. And suddenly the weight of those sacrifices felt unbearable. Perhaps this wasn't about competing with Lily at all. Perhaps this was about reclaiming the space you had been told never to take. So, with trembling hands, you whispered, yes, let's do it. The words surprised you with their strength. For the first time in years, you felt a decision that belonged entirely to you. It wasn't granted, negotiated, or measured. It was yours. The following days became a whirlwind of planning, though not in the way your family might have imagined. There were no endless guest lists or extravagant demands. Instead, there was intimacy. 25 names, each belonging to someone who had stood beside you, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Friends, mentors, colleagues who had celebrated your vision when family would not. You began assembling photographs of weddings you had captured not to compare, but to learn. You studied which moments felt alive, which details revealed truth. The laughter of a grandmother, the clasp of hands, the quiet tears no one else noticed. These were the moments that mattered, the moments you wanted for yourself. As you worked, the fear of your parents' disapproval lingered at the edges of your thoughts. But slowly, it lost its power. For the first time, you realized that their voices were not the only ones that could shape your life. You had your own voice, and it was steady. One evening, you sat across from Ethan as the sun set outside your apartment window. You spread out brochures and photographs across the table, your hands moving with certainty. This is not about revenge, close quote, you told him. This is about creating something real. He smiled, eyes warm with pride. Then let's make it beautiful. And so you did. Each choice became an act of defiance, but also of freedom. Choosing a simple silk dress instead of a grand gown was not just a matter of taste, it was a declaration that you would no longer measure yourself against someone else's definition of perfection. Selecting jasmine vines and olive branches was not only aesthetic, it was a reminder that beauty could be found in what was natural, unforced, authentic. The guest list became its own story. With each name written, you felt lighter. These were the people who had seen you, truly seen you, even when your family refused. They were not bound by obligation, but by love. For once, you were not performing for approval, you were creating for belonging. Still, the shadows of your family reached for you. A cousin called, her voice heavy with the weight of whispers. Your mother is telling everyone you are trying to ruin Lily's wedding, close quote, she said. For a moment, the old shame threatened to return. But as you looked around your apartment, at the walls covered with notes and plans, you realized you no longer needed to defend yourself. Their narrative belonged to them. Yours was different. At night, when doubt crept close, Ethan reminded you of the truth. "This is not about them," close quote, he whispered. "This is about us." And in his eyes, you found the courage to keep building. The closer the date came, the more the contrast grew. On one side, a wedding draped in luxury and expectation, built to impress. On the other, a ceremony shaped by authenticity, built to honor love itself. The comparison was inevitable, but you no longer cared. For the first time, your life was not being measured against someone else's standard. It was unfolding according to your own. And then came the night you said it aloud. Standing on the balcony, the city glowing beneath you, you whispered into the dark, "I am done shrinking." The words felt like a vow, more binding than any spoken at an altar. You had lived too long in the margins of someone else's story. Now, it was time to write your own. As plans solidified, a calmness took root. You still felt the ache of rejection, but it no longer defined you. Instead, it became fuel, shaping your resolve. You would not beg for a seat at their table. You would build your own. And this time, you would not apologize for the space you occupied. The turning point was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, like the slow rise of dawn after the longest night. But within that stillness, everything changed. For the first time in your life, you felt not erased, but present. Not diminished, but whole. And as you drifted to sleep that night, you realized the truth. Your story had already begun to shift. The uninvited daughter was no longer waiting at the door. She was walking forward, head held high, into life she would claim as her own. The air of Italy greeted you with a softness you had never known before. Standing on the cliffs of Amalfi, you felt the sea wind brush against your skin, carrying with it the scent of jasmine and salt. For years you had captured the light of other people's joy, but now, as the sun slipped lower toward the horizon, that light finally belonged to you. The villa was older than memory itself, with weathered stones that seemed to hold centuries of vows and secrets. Yet in its age, it carried something steady, a reminder that love, when true, could outlast even the longest storms. As you walked through its archways, you imagined your story being woven into the walls, not as a shadow, but as something whole. Guests began to arrive in the soft afternoon glow. They were not many, only 25, but each face brought warmth that filled the space far more than numbers ever could. These were not people who had come out of obligation or expectation. They had come out of love, out of respect, out of recognition of who you truly were. You looked into their eyes and saw no judgment, no comparisons, no whispers, only the reflection of your worth. When you stepped into your simple silk dress, the world felt quiet. It was not the gown of a princess or the spectacle of a stage. It was fabric that moved with you, light and unpretentious, just as you had always wanted. You thought of the many brides you had dressed in photographs, the moments you had watched them breathe in deeply before walking forward. Now, for the first time, you understood the weight of those breaths. Ethan stood waiting under an arbor of olive branches and jasmine vines. The golden hour light spilled across the terrace, painting everything in tones of amber and rose. You saw him not just as the man beside you, but as the anchor who had reminded you of your own strength when you had nearly forgotten it. His eyes held wonder, not because of a dress or a stage, but because you had chosen to stand fully in your own story. The ceremony began with no grandeur, no excess. The officiant spoke quietly, his words carried more by sincerity than by volume. "Marriage is not only the joining of two people," close quote, he said, "but the creation of a new story, one that belongs to no one else." His words settled deep into your bones, resonating with every choice that had led you here. When Ethan spoke his vows, you felt the room still. "I promise to see you," close quote, he said, "not just to look at you, but to truly see you. To celebrate your success as if it were mine. To build a life where your light never needs to be dimmed." His voice remained steady, but in his eyes you saw the rawness of truth. When it was your turn, your hands trembled only slightly as you unfolded the paper. "I promise to stand tall beside you," close quote, you said, your voice catching but strong. "To create beauty without apology. To remember that love does not require permission." And with those words, the weight of years seemed to lift, replaced by something lighter, something entirely your own. The rings were exchanged as the Mediterranean behind you turned into liquid gold. Photographers captured the moment, not as a performance, but as a truth unfolding. When the officiant finally spoke the words, "You are now joined," close quote, the applause that erupted was not polite or restrained. It was full, genuine, echoing across the terrace and out into the sea air. Dinner followed beneath strings of lights that glowed like constellations against the darkening sky. Laughter rose easily from the tables. Guests leaned into conversations, music floated gently between them, and for the first time in your life, you sat in the center of a story not as an afterthought, but as a beating heart. At one point, James, one of your closest photographer friends, approached you with his camera in hand. "You need to see this," close quote, he said, showing you an image he had captured. There you were, standing beside Ethan, the sea stretching endless behind you, the light framing you both in a halo of gold. It was a photograph so perfect that even you, who had always critiqued your own work, could not deny its truth. "This," close quote, James whispered, "is art." Later that night, the image began to spread. Friends shared it, then colleagues, then strangers who had never heard your name. Comments flooded in, not about extravagance or spectacle, but about the authenticity that radiated from the frame. For years you had given this gift to others, capturing their joy with your lens. Now, for the first time, the world was seeing yours. Messages arrived from cousins who had once been silent, from acquaintances who had believed your parents' stories. Some carried admiration, others regret. But you no longer needed their approval. Their voices could no longer define you. The validation you once craved had been replaced by something far stronger. The quiet certainty that you had chosen your own life. As the evening deepened, Giovanni, the villa's caretaker, raised his glass for a toast. "I have seen many ceremonies here," close quote, he said, his Italian accent warm, but rarely one that carried such honesty. True love does not compete. True love simply exists, and by existing, it transforms everything around it. His words lingered long after the glasses clinked, echoing the very truth you had come to embody. When the music slowed and the stars spread wide across the sky, you found yourself standing at the edge of the terrace with Ethan. The sea below shimmered like scattered jewels. You leaned into him, realizing that this moment was not about defying your family, nor proving your worth. It was about finally choosing a life where you could stand without apology.